practices of those who are involved, who are down to the ground realities of project implementation. And we're able to share this knowledge. We're also able to share our best practices, or even practices which we don't think are working. And as Paul said, it's both the positives and negatives, it's the successes and failures. And we're also, through the lesson identification process, able to generate evidence. And one of the great things about generating evidence is that we're able to disseminate it, and we're able to disseminate it through articles, through conferences, so that it reaches a much, much wider audience than perhaps just our sector, or just the donors and our partners we are working with. And the ultimate purpose of this entire exercise is to improve our performance. Not just the performance of the teams, but ultimately the performance of the donors, the performance of the sector. And we want to achieve change. So if we know something hasn't worked, it means we have to change behaviors, we have to develop new approaches, and we have to develop new skills. So we have to change in a way that allows us to learn from the mistakes or even the successes that we have achieved.
Great. And we have contributions here from Rachel Gatagu. Why we do it, or why we do these lessons learned: to inform our decision making on future programming. Excellent. What can we replicate? So what's good, but what can we stop doing in terms of what's bad? And then we have one from Mary Lynn. Lessons learned greatly help the stakeholders to share what worked, absolutely, and did not work in many areas of practice.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So I'll move on to the second one is, so what are these? Where do they come from? And please do keep on adding. And Paul, can I ask you to then take over and read some of those as you have?
Sure.
So to me, as I said, they are experiences, but in a meeting, not everybody can attend the meetings that we have as projects. And so what we need to do is we need to document them. And those documents that we produce, we are able to disseminate them widely through some of the channels that I have mentioned earlier. And they are literally verifiable documentation of our insights, our analysis of what has and hasn't worked during implementation. They are our knowledge of understanding gained by experience, and again, both the negative and the positive. So that's basically what a lesson learned is. When do we do it? Well, we'll cover this in a little bit more detail in the next slide, but it's usually done after we have implemented a project. Now, we can wait right until the end, or as we have project reviews, for example, annual project reviews, they can be done at that stage. It's completely up to the project or the program to decide when you want to do them. So, of course, if you do them right at the end of the project, it means you're not going to be able to use some of your learning to course correct because you finished the project. While if you do it throughout the project, you are able to use that learning to make changes in your interventions.
I would just add that absolutely, I think the correct time to do it is at the end of a project or post-project. But I think sometimes the mentality of collecting lessons, of being aware and being able to capture those lessons will need to be on the forefront of project implementers' minds as they're actually doing the project. So being aware and taking note of lessons, so that at the end of the project you can go through a proper process of sort of reflecting on how the project went, what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, great. And I think it also depends on the purpose of why you are doing it, and that will determine the timings of when you want to do it. And so I guess when you're thinking about doing it, always think of why. What am I going to get out of it? How am I going to use the outcomes of these exercises?
And we have a comment from Liliane Natinda. And the comment is to influence people's ways of working and avoid making similar mistakes. So this sort of goes into the the why and the when. So I think finding the right touch points and the right points in time to really reflect and to really have the maximum impact in terms of influencing people's ways of working, and to avoid similar mistakes in other project implementations.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't think we're actually very good at doing that. I think we repeat a lot of our experiences again and again without taking a step back and taking stock of what we should take forward and what we should just drop and leave behind. So the final question to this slide is, so who does this? Well, it's you as the project implementers. It's the donors who are the program implementers. They should also do it. So I think it's at various levels, and anybody who's involved in the projects and the programs should take themselves and should take their partners and their implementers through this exercise. So it's project implementers. It's also your monitoring and evaluation and learning specialists who have the skills to bring you together and to enable you to, or to facilitate the teams to draw out some of these lessons. Of course, it's researchers, and we'll talk about external evaluations and how external evaluations are increasingly having a lesson learning component to them. And so that's your researchers and your evaluators who are contributing to or generating the evidence within your specialist fields. Of course, it's also funders. They need to know where they should put their funding, and therefore, and of course, they want to fund those projects which are going to reap the results. So it's very, very important for them to know what does and what doesn't work. And of course, any other stakeholder within the programs and the projects in the sector who has an interest, and any interest, whether it's as users of this information, as beneficiaries, as implementers. So I guess anybody who's involved in this entire cycle, or as Paul calls it, in the ecosystem of project implementation, should go through this process.
Yeah, and we have a good point from Eric Debert, and he has asked, which sort of fits into the what, how do we do it? So how is it? What is the underlying methodology, and for who? So Robina just touched on that. You know, who are the key audiences for these lessons learned? Obviously, it would be project stakeholders, funders, beneficiaries, even.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, it's a really important thing, because it's quite a time-consuming process when you do lesson learning exercises. It's really important, one, to think of the purpose, and secondly, to think of your audience. Now, usually the audience is yourselves, because you're doing a reflection of what you have done. But I think it's actually limiting you need to get your experiences or the outcomes of these exercises out to other people and other audiences. So it's worth taking a step back to say, well, how can we disseminate, and who can we disseminate what we have learned from our projects beyond our own organizations and our own partners? And I think that's when you are really contributing to future projects.
Yeah, we have a question here, which is actually a very good one from Eve. And it is, are we going as well to respond to the how question? What are the enabling factors, internal system, for example, internal systems and culture that enable but also deter the proper sort of sharing of lessons?
Yeah, so we'll touch briefly on the process of identifying lessons. I think it's something slightly bigger than this webinar, when we want to talk about systems and how do we develop those systems. And I think it's a really, really important question. Is it just something that's attached to a project and we do it because it's expected of us? Or do we actually develop our internal systems so lesson learning becomes part and parcel of what we do? In any department, in any project, it's the ethos of the organization. So yeah, it's a really important question. It's something I don't think we're going to touch on the systems bit, but we will in the next slide touch on the process or some of the activities that you can do to identify the lessons, the how bit.
And do we have time for 2 more comments?
Yeah.
So from Shahida, We have to inform future programming and to share experiences with broader humanitarian actors/sectors for replication and scale up, absolutely. And it contributes to science, policy, and practice. We also have Ian, who has said the majority of lessons within the START Fund are captured and discussed within 2 to 3 weeks after project completion. But we've at times considered gathering lessons during project implementation, so during the project, and also checking in several months later to see which lessons and recommendations led to improvements. Curious if anyone has thoughts on cost benefits of this. Cost benefits of, Ian, is this cost benefits of the process of collecting lessons learned, or cost benefits as part of the lessons learned process?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, by cost benefits, I guess I meant that, I mean, at times we've considered, I guess we don't want to bother project leads necessarily when they're in the middle of implementation because they have, you know, other priorities. But on the other hand, the lessons may be more at the forefront of their minds, and we may be able to actually apply some of those lessons during the project itself prior to. So those sort of things I kind of grapple with when I consider the timeframes of when we should you know, put in our learning processes. And then similarly, yeah, when it comes to the application of learnings, maybe the webinar gets to this later, but it's often a challenge for us to know how late should we wait to then actually check in to see whether the lessons have actually been applied. And then speaking with projects months later also has the benefit of looking at a crisis, you know, more broadly and kind of seeing a little bit more long-term what some reflections might be, which might be a bit different than the short-term reflections.
No, very good point, Ian. And I think you know, the cost and the benefits of the process is something we'll get into here and hopefully discuss a bit later
Great,
as well.
thanks.
Yeah. Great. Shall we move to the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I just wanted to, and again, this is quite briefly and doesn't touch on the systems bit, but what do we do to identify the lessons from the work that you are doing? And there was a survey that was conducted which identified a number of methods for identifying lessons. These included post-project reviews, which we have spoken about. It also included after-action reviews, which are slightly different and take much shorter time period. There's also individuals, you know, if you can speak to individuals involved in the project, and that's individual submission of the lessons based on that individual experience. External reviews, these are external evaluations, which we are all expected to do as part of our projects. And of course, there's a much bigger program level evaluations. We can also identify lessons from analyzing incidents and events. Of all these, the most common that was highlighted within the survey was post-project or post-program reviews and after-action reviews. And I think it's one which we're all familiar with and something that we are in the habit of doing. So I'll go through very briefly each one. So post-project reviews, these are the most tested ways for capturing lessons at the end of the project. This involves looking back at what has happened in the project and what has been achieved compared to what your original objectives were. So for example, you may look at what went wrong or what went right. And if you want to dig slightly deeper, you also may want to look at what were the causes behind things that went wrong, or what were the factors that contributed to the success of your project. This usually involves your whole team. So that can vary depending on the size and the makeup of your projects and your programs. The whole team could be just the implementing team. It could also involve partners. And if it's a multi-country project, of course, it involves partners across your countries. So they should be involved in this process of undertaking reflection. And it is time consuming. So again, it depends on what aspect of the project you want to include into your review, which aspects you want to dig deeper. And that will determine the amount of time that you need to put aside for this process. And it will also determine who needs to be involved and at what stage. Ultimately, what you want to come out with is some sort of recommendations based on the lessons that you have identified, and advice for future projects. Now, because this is a post-project review, you can't go back and course correct, and therefore the purpose is to come up with recommendation and advice for all those who are going to be taking up or working in either similar environments or in a similar sector or targeting similar problems. So, for example, I work within the Disaster and Emergencies Preparedness Program. One of the lessons that we have identified is that collaboration, which is one of the pillars of this program, actually takes time. And therefore, the recommendation is that, well, we need to factor in more time. We need to give the projects more time at the inception phase. So there needs to be an inception phase built into the program before project implementation starts. Now, because there wasn't an inception phase built in, what it meant is that a lot of the projects had to spend a lot of time in forming these collaborations. And therefore, now that we are reaching towards the end of the program, we've kind of like run out of time because that time was taken up at the beginning. And therefore, going forward, what DFID, if they have learned anything from this, is that they need to build in an inception period, which doesn't factor in implementation time. So 6 months plus 3 years is what will allow the projects to form these collaborations and also to implement the time for the full 3 years. You could also go further and also ask questions such as, well, how do we, if you've identified some problems or some failures, well, what do we do next time? What do we do to avoid such problems in the future? Or what advice do we give to projects to overcome some of these problems should they face them? How do we repeat success? And what can we give to projects? So we talked about documentation, and Paul will talk about developing a lessons paper. So how do we document these? What format should they be? They should be actually easy, accessible documents that projects or project teams can pick up and read very easily in a kind of like a digestible format to deliver much better projects in the future. So that's post-project reviews. The other one, which is actually very similar to post-project reviews, is after-action review. This was initially developed by the US military, but it has now been widely used and accepted as a method for lesson identification across sectors and industries. So this is much shorter than a project review, and in the format of, for example, review meetings, which we do quite regularly. And it's to draw up lessons on activities that we are implementing rather than a whole project or a whole program. And the purpose of this is to help teams to gain immediate feedback on, for example, their performance, and to immediately allow them to apply the lessons or the recommendations emerging from the lesson identification exercise immediately for the purpose of course correction. And so the benefits of doing an after-action review are for the immediate teams who are undertaking the task rather than your future teams. Although, of course, there's no reason why what you have learned through these after-action reviews can't ultimately feed into your project reviews. And then you have the external evaluations or the external reviews, where you have third-party evaluators or third-party researchers coming in at some point. End of project evaluations would be at the end of your project. And as I said at the beginning, a lot of the time now, when you have a look at contracts for third-party evaluations, there is a lesson learning component. And the evaluators will be required to assess program results against the objectives. And in the process, they can draw out lessons for future programming. So this is much more targeted to donors because they fund these programs. But if it's a project level evaluation, then of course it's targeted much more for the project, for the organizations that's implementing the project. So as an example, I've had experience of working, my background's in education, so I've worked on lots of education projects. One of them was being implemented in Pakistan. And we did a process evaluation, and what we found was that there weren't many relevant projects being attracted. They wanted innovative projects to tackle the problem of attendance, the problem of enrollment, the problem of quality education, the three main things in education. And what we found is one of the reasons why that wasn't happening was they were holding the implementers, they were holding workshops in the capital city, Islamabad. Now, of course, we know that organizations are not just based in the capital city, they are scattered all across the country. And so as a result of this, one of the recommendations was that you actually need to go out of the capital city into various key cities to raise awareness about the program in the hope that you're able to attract more relevant projects which are able to send you proposals to tackle the problems that you are targeting. So Paul, do you have anything to add in that? Or
we had some very good comments that just came through in response. We have one from Mary Lynn. The post-project review may include everyone involved, including victims, beneficiaries, and partners. Absolutely. When victims, project beneficiaries learn from their own experience, they can also help themselves to heal quickly from their traumas and failures. So I think the point there is to really get information from a variety of sources. Sometimes just focusing on project implementers will limit the depth and the reach in terms of what you're trying to assess and analyze. That's a good point. Eric has been very kind to share with us a good resource from UNICEF, which contains very practical tools and captures on capturing lessons learned before, during, and after a project initiative. That's shared in the chat. The Zoom chat box. So I think we can also share that afterwards. And then a last comment from Eve. The advantages and disadvantages of post-project reviews as a process of identifying learning. So that's asked as a question. So I think I'll respond to that. I mean, we'll get into this a little bit later as we discuss formulating your lessons paper or your lessons process. And I think there are certainly advantages and disadvantages, and there's a sort of a balance that one must find between when it is appropriate to conduct these post-project reviews. I think one recognizes the fact that it takes staff time and it does take resources away from the project if it's ongoing. Generally, at the end of a project, there's time. There should be time, but there never is. So it's really about thinking about when it is the optimal time to assess and to look at and to reflect on the project. But I'll get into that as we proceed.
Great, thanks, Paul. I think slide 6 is yours.
Yep. So next slide. Great. So in terms of developing your lessons paper, I think there are some key elements that one should consider in terms of structuring your paper, and the first one being a really sort of complete understanding of what the goals and objectives are, first of all, what you're trying to accomplish, and then providing a reflection and assessment on those goals and objectives. The second thing would be the identification of activities or areas needing additional effort, additional focus, things that did go well, but also things that didn't go well, things that didn't go as planned. So how much did you deviate from the project plan? Why did you deviate? Did those deviations from what was the intended plan help the project? Were there extenuating circumstances in terms of why the project wasn't able to stay to plan? Were there additional resources or budget that were required at different points? And it's really about thinking and reflecting on those aspects of the program implementation. I believe the next, I'm sorry, we've lost our screen. The next section would be the comparison, identification of effective activities or strategies. So these really are about ways in which you've responded to challenges in terms of the project implementation, really looking at strategies, both post-project, but strategies that were deployed during the project, and sort of were they effective, were they not effective, were there other strategies that could have been deployed, and really sort of giving some thought to that in terms of that identification process. And then comparison of costs and results of different activities. So these are activities that were ongoing. So you sometimes do have this ability to decide between particular directions that you want to take a project, particular activities that you undertake, and really doing a proper assessment of the costs and what those costs yield in terms of different activities that were undertaken during the project implementation. And then the assessment of the roles of organizations in the project, and roles of organizations, key stakeholders, individuals, and interactions among organizations. This is something that's rarely looked at, but the ability to collaborate well between organizations, and typically it's not one organization that's doing a fairly large project, or even smaller projects, and those interactions between different organizations, different individuals, need to be really assessed to see if there was the optimal level of collaboration between the different actors as part of the project. And it's really important that be done, and that can be done through stakeholders analysis, really getting the viewpoints of the different project implementation team members, and different organizations that were contributing to the project. I think we have 2 comments that have come through. Okay, yeah. So I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, so to assess goals and objectives, consider these questions. First of all, were the program objectives appropriate for the program goals? Were they well aligned to what you were trying to do? Were they aligned in terms of what you were trying to accomplish? Second question is, were the objectives met? And that really is about reflecting on evaluation results. Some of the objectives can be very obvious at the end of a project. Were they met? Did you achieve what you were trying to do? And if not, why? Does any new information about the hypothesis, the underlying theory of change, need to be incorporated into the program messages or design? And that's something that does require a little bit of sort of thought and reflection. To what degree did the project, the underlying hypothesis in terms of what you were trying to do, the intervention, really stand the test of being implemented? Did it actually play out, or were there problems with the underlying assumptions that were being made, the level of causality that was assumed in terms of what the program was trying to do? I mean, additional issues to consider include, were any objective unmet, as we mentioned before, and were any strategies or activities unsuccessful? Should these activities be continued, renewed, or strengthened? And finally, to identify effective strategies or activities, consider these questions. Were some of these objectives met as a result of successful activities? Can these activities be expanded to apply to other audiences or situations? So if you had activities that were extremely successful, could these be applied in other situations with other projects, and to meet the needs of other beneficiary audiences as well? Okay, we can move to the next slide. All right, to assess the cost and collaboration components of a project review or any sort of lessons learned as documentation that you'd like to produce, you compare the costs and results of different activities and ask what were the relative costs, including staff time, excuse me, and results of different aspects of your program. So in this, you're basically looking and you're comparing, the costs, both in time and the financial costs as well, and against the results that were achieved of different aspects of your program. So that will take a little bit of preparatory work in terms of what you're doing, but actually presenting and doing some comparative analysis between those different aspects of the program. Did some activities appear to work as well as others, but cost less? So looking for potential efficiencies within your project implementation activities. So identifying those efficiencies and potentially expanding them or scaling them up in terms of the particular activities, if appropriate. Assess the roles of organizations in the project and the way that these organizations work together. So this is what we touched on in the previous slide, and this relates to how well the different partners work together, and really sort of doing some assessment, preferably with the partners in the room. I think this is the better way of doing it, and asking the following questions. Did any conflicts of organizational agendas or operating styles, conflicts of interest occur? And I think that's something that needs to happen during the project as well as after the project. But I think ideally it's something that that does need to be assessed, and a robust sort of assessment provided in terms of how well these different organizations worked, how could they have worked better, what were the issues, and how did we mitigate them, or how did we not mitigate them. And then the final question is, how did the timing of the program coordinate with the different organizations involved? So timing is something that I think is very important in terms of making sure that everyone's on the same page, on the team, working to the same deadlines, but also that the interdependencies within the program in terms of delivery and coordination as well is optimal. And so that needs to be really looked at and assessed, and preferably, again, not just post-project, but during the project, and at key touch points during the project, and also preceding the project, so that people are doing that. But how well did that actually transpire during the project, and doing an after-action review that really does encapsulate that as well. Next slide. Okay. And so this is around taking action and disseminating. And so the points here are really about, once you've done the analysis, once you've gotten everyone together to really assess the program, you have all this information, you have this valuable analysis, what do you do with it? It doesn't just end there. It doesn't end up in a report that ends up on a shelf somewhere. You really do need to take action and disseminate this to as wide an audience as possible, so that it actually does result in actions and improvements and changes. So some of the key points here include, what were the lessons identified? They must lead to action if they are to be implemented and learned from. So in order for this to be a valuable process, something of that yields improvements in program implementation, they need to be shared, and they need to be followed up. So there needs to be an action plan connected to any sort of lessons learned documentation that you produce. I mean, producing the analysis and the lessons learned is the first step. The final and more important step is to identify, what actions need to be taken. The second point is around developing the related action plan is my point that I just made, to inform future planning, both for future work around the project, but also other similar projects and projects that might be coming down the pipeline. And then you have publishing and disseminating of a lessons paper, which is providing that and generating that evidence that can be shared within the sector. Next slide. with the end?
Well, can I just go back to
Yep.
the previous slide?
Sure.
And I just wanted to add, so for example, on the action plan, while of course, if the project review is for the future and is done at the end of the project, an action plan may apply if your project if your organization is going to go for that project or a second phase of that project. But I think an action plan is actually more important if you're doing project reviews during the project. And this is where you develop the action plan and include, number one, the actions that are to be taken, who is responsible for implementing these, and two, then this allows you to monitor progress of implementation and, of course, the timelines for implementing some of these actions. So I think an action plan is much, much more important for interim project reviews as opposed to future projects.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's of great value during a project because then it then informs project implementation that's ongoing. I would say that that I do think that most lessons plans unfortunately don't contain actions, tangible actions that people can take forward.
Yeah.
So I think that goes back to identifying lessons, but also strategies in terms of mitigating some of the issues, some of the challenges, so that people can actually take away something in terms of practical guidance on how they actually address those issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Paul. I think that's it from our side, and I think we can open up the floor for discussion on anything or any of the aspects that we have covered in the webinar. And I think also going forward, if there's anything more that people want information on, we can always get that information together and get it to you guys, or we can identify more resources which would be of help. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts.
We have a comment from Eric about whether there was a template on dissemination action plan. Are we talking about an action plan to incorporate lessons learned or to disseminate lessons learned?
Yeah.
It's no, it's an action plan that's part of the lessons learned document is I think what we were referring to.
Yeah.
Although I think an action plan to disseminate lessons learned is also a good idea as well.
Yeah, I think so.
I think making sure that you do put some thought into dissemination and how you want to share your knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really important point, because while we're not very good at making recommendations and we are good at kind of like discussing lessons, we're also, I don't think, that good at then moving on to the final stage, which is having an action plan on how do we now disseminate some of these recommendations and some of the findings from this exercise. And I think all that can actually be included in your action plan. So it's not just the actions you want to take, it's not the timings when you want to implement those actions, but also, who else do you want to disseminate your findings about these lessons learned to? So yeah, I think it's a really important part of your action plan. But
yes,
we don't actually have sorry, Paul, we don't actually have a template per se, which was, I think, Eric's initial question.
Yeah.
But I think a template could be put together, and I think it's very similar to a work plan that you would put together for a project.
Excellent.
So Paul, did you want to pick up on, so Eric has talked about the action plan.
Yeah, we have some other comments. So we have some other comments coming through now related to this call. Do you have any recommendations for how a lessons paper can be enticing to read? So making your lessons paper compelling or engaging, I think that's a really good point. I think my big the point that I would emphasize in terms of making something compelling or generally, but in something engaging, is really about really making it relevant to the audience that you are speaking to. So, keeping it relevant to what you think their needs are from an information standpoint. What would they benefit from in terms of this? Some unique aspect of the project that isn't obvious, isn't necessarily readily apparent to those participating, especially project implementers tend to be quite busy in the project and they're in the weeds, and I think taking a step back and reflecting during these post-project reviews and thinking about what is it that you learned, what is it that you've seen that might be of value to others. I think staying away from the obvious is obviously important as well. We have a question from Ed. Does anyone have recommendations on how to encourage a culture of recording and sharing lessons learned at the organizational level? Rubina, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it actually has to come down from for me, it's as much about a management thing. So if it's part and parcel of your management that, in your weekly meetings while you're discussing a lot of your logistics stuff and HR issues, I think also having this as an agenda point, on as regular basis as you have other meetings, it's really important. And I think that's how the entire, irrespective of who's working on what projects, it can become part of the organization. And I think also making sure that, when you are developing your strategies, I know of some organizations who actually developed lesson learning strategies, organizational lesson learning strategies, and then everybody has an induction on that, and everybody knows that that's part and parcel of the organization ethos.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think there's a really, really good point from Ian about keeping your lessons learned, your documentation short. I think people don't have a lot of time to read long documents, and I think keeping it short and snappy can be helpful in terms of keeping people's attention and really getting them to reflect on what you're saying and to read the document.
Yeah, and I think, we've got a webinar coming up on packaging and disseminating various documentations. And one of the things that we have found is, again, as Paul, you have said, keep it short. So it is keep it short, keep it accessible, so easy to read. And I think also, apart from because we have a habit when we develop papers, it's very text heavy. And I think what we're finding is if you're able to combine text with some good design, and I know Alice is here in part of the meeting and we rely on her to do a lot of our designing, but infographics combined with text, which is capturing, and just focus on the key headline findings. And if people want more information, you can always add links or provide a supplementary document. But I think as kind of like just pick up and go, and read something on the move, it is a 1 to 2 page, a very short key headlines that you want to have in the papers.
And Eric has actually made a good point as well in terms of keeping your lessons learned documentation compelling and engaging to draw in readers is not necessarily always to make them text-based. You can also use graphics and photo stories to animate what you're talking about, and I think that tends to draw in readers and keep them engaged quite a bit. Very good point, Eric. Mary Lynn, in sharing lessons, a picture of the past and present situation may be included with a caption or a brief or one-word title of the lessons learned. That's definitely, that goes to the potentially using non-text-based representations of what you're trying to say. Ian says, our lessons learned docs for each Start Fund response is no more than 2 pages. Wow, impressive. Marilyn, is in our case, we usually limit lessons learned in just one or two paragraphs. Wow, even better. So we have a competition growing here. Usually a half page of top findings. This is from Ian. Then another half page with key recommendations, the latter of which we then copy paste directly into emails that we send to project leads and other stakeholders. That's a very good approach. I think pulling out the relevant bits from your overall document and sending them directly to the people who would find it most relevant and most helpful is a great strategy in terms of dissemination. And engaging the key actors who would benefit most from this process. And then Vine, are there different learning approaches, templates, tools that one may use with regular programming from emergency and disaster response? Perhaps this may not be able to tackle here. We may not be able to tackle this here, but looking forward to it. Are there any existing templates or tools? I think there was a question earlier around this that deal with regular programming of emergency response disasters.
I haven't actually come across any, but happy to look into them and share them.
Yeah, I think it would be useful. Well,
I'm just wondering, as I was just listening to you and just reading through the comments, I'm just wondering whether, because I've asked many people this question, is there a kind of like a how to do note or a how to do guide that documents a lot of these suggestions that we've been getting today? And I'm wondering, off the back of this webinar, whether it would be useful for us to put something together, a how to do guide or a how to do note, which is quick and easy. And that incorporates things that we have included in this presentation, but also draws upon the comments that we have received through this webinar.
Yeah, I think that could be of value. I think there are probably some guides out there already that might be of value as well. So potentially we could share those. We have a comment coming through from David Jones. Let's start. I think he says, I think that playing amateur psychologist has some value, true. Who are you targeting? What do you want them to do as a result of engaging with the learning? And critically, why would you want to do it personally, professionally, and organizationally, considering the incentives for them to create action from your learning? So that's a very key insight in terms of how one would formulate these lessons learned.
Yeah, really important.
And then we have one from Saiful. Very helpful discussion. Can you discuss in an emergency plan for a short time? Can you discuss the relevance within an emergency plan? We might need you to clarify that a bit, Saiful, to be able to speak to us. Don't think he has audio. I am deciphering the question as really being around whether lessons learned could potentially contribute to an emergency plan within a short period of time, potentially. And I mean, if that's the question you're asking, I think I think it would. I think this process and this approach can definitely be applied to most interventions and most projects and programs, and it's something that I think an emergency plan process or formulation would benefit from.
And I think it will actually, because it's for a short period of time and it's for an emergency, which probably wasn't foreseen. I think you may have to actually draw upon experiences of previous emergencies. And why, if that previous emergency team has done a review and has documented it, you could access that. If they haven't, then there's nothing available. So you may have to just go back and just talk to that team if you know where they are. And I think that really highlights the importance of doing this exercise, particularly for emergencies, because they just come and we don't know they're going to occur. And therefore, if something is available, we can use those as we develop our plans very quickly to tackle them.
Yeah. We have two more points that have come through for emergency plan. Okay, in response to Saiful's question, we have Shahida who's said that it can be linked to a simulation exercise to analyze level of preparedness. That sounds quite intensive. And what could be the process if the lessons learned are to be collected for more than 2 projects of a program which one is ongoing and others have ended? So I think this question goes to, can you collect lessons for multiple projects, some of which are ongoing and some of which have ended?
Yeah, I think you can. And I think, so the DEP is a really good example of that, where there's staggered implementation timelines. And we know some projects are going to be ending, let's say, for example, December, others are going to be ending in February, and there are a few which are going to be ending in March. And I think for a project like ours, where it's responsible for extracting that learning and doing the research and doing the evaluations at the program level, this responsibility sits with these teams who can look at what the projects have produced and try to aggregate those lessons from different projects under different themes. So it's absolutely, definitely possible. It depends on when you need it and, again, what purpose you need it for. But there's no reason why it can't be done.
Great. Okay.
Great.
I think we're nearing the end of our time. So I think a lot of people are signing off at this point. Should we bring things to a close, Rabina?
I think so. Yeah, I think. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for being on the call. And we hope to put something together and share that with you. We'll also share some resources as they come our way. So thank you very much. Alice, thanks for hosting this. Paul, thank you for co-hosting.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.